Monsters in D&D are two sides of the same coin, meaning that you need both of them to have a whole or complete product. This isn't just something specific to Dungeons and Dragons, but rather games in general, whether they be video, tabletop, or even card games now. So what are monsters? Well, in 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is the edition I tend to focus on, monsters are broken up into 14 categories: aberrations, beasts, celestials, constructs, dragons, elementals, fae, fiends, giants, humanoids, monstrosities, oozes, plants, or the undead. Depending on where you're reading from, monsters often swapped out with creature. So for the sake of being brief, it's best to just think of the word monster as a catch-all for almost everything in the D&D universe. This includes all the playable races in the player's handbook and its supplements, as well as pretty much anything you can imagine fighting in the game itself. Note, monstrosities are a category of monsters, so all monstrosities are monsters, but not all monsters are monstrosities, so try not to get hung up on that too much. So with monster being the umbrella term for almost everything, let's get a bit more specific, and specifically we'll be talking about goblinoids, which are a race of creatures in the humanoid category. The humanoid monster category tends to encompass all the races that a majority of players will become acquainted with in their travels: dwarves, elves, humans, as well as orcs, gnolls, and lizard folk. Humanoids vary greatly in many aspects, but they tend to have language and culture and can fall anywhere on the alignment spectrum. They can also be civilized or savage. So the defining characteristics of the humanoid category are: 1. They have language and culture. 2. Few, if any, innate magical abilities, though most humanoids can learn spellcasting. And 3. They tend to be bipedal, meaning they usually walk on two legs. With all of that info out of the way, let's talk about goblinoids. The goblinoid races include goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears. Interestingly, as far as 5th edition is concerned, the goblinoid races are not related in any way genetically. They don't even have similar characteristics between them. The goblins are cowardly tricksters that tend to lie, or at least play games with the truth more often than not. Hobgoblins are militaristic, organized warlords, and bugbears are close to primal savages that look more like Bigfoot than a goblin or hobgoblin. They're actually related through the fact that they are races that have been completely conquered and subjugated by Maglubiet, who I will call Maglu from this point forward just because it's easier to work with. To give you a better idea of the type of entity Maglu is, let me read you this entry from Volo's Guide to Monsters.
Maglubiet is truly the conquering god. He stiffens the spines of the cowardly goblins, he rouses bugbears from their lazy slumber, and he sets the thunderous step of hobgoblin legions. Maglubiet takes 3 races and turns them into one people. In bygone times, the goblinoids were distinct from one another, with separate faiths and different customs. Then Maglubiet came and conquered all who stood before him, mortals and deities alike. Gods and heroes who wouldn't bend to his will were broken and discarded. He put his foot on the neck of mighty Kugorbieg, bound the will of intractable Hrugek, and forced sadistic Nomagea to fall in line. What the goblins, the bugbears, and the hobgoblins were before their gods bowed to Maglubiet no longer matters. Now, they are first of all followers of Maglubiet. On the surface, goblins, bugbears, and hobgoblins are as different as halflings, dwarves, and elves. Each race has its own tendencies, outlook, culture, and gods. But Maglubiet's hand joins them together, just as he made all their other gods parts within a greater whole. When one kind of goblinoid encounters another kind, the two groups don't see one another as strangers or foes. Instead, they know that by the fact of their meeting alone, Maglubiet has commanded them to come together. They know the time has come to form a host.
Maglu has not stopped his conquest and is attempting to conquer the Orcish pantheon and take control of the orcs that follow Gruumsh. So there is a possibility that in newer editions of D&D that the orcs may also become one of the goblinoid races, but for now, they're still Orcish. Even though they're now part of Maglu's mortal ranks in his attempt to conquer all the gods, what were the Goblinoid races before being assimilated? Well, if we stop at Volo's Guide to Monsters, whatever they were doesn't matter anymore. But if we're to continue onwards to Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Universe, then the Goblinoids were, drumroll please, Fae? Like, elves? Wasn't expecting that one. It's important to note that these changes are for the playable character race version of these monsters. Even though the Fae ancestry is now canon, I won't go into all of the changes done to each of these races. The biggest thing I want you to take away is that their origins are that of Fae from the Feywild. So we have a god that loves war, with an insatiable appetite to conquer, and 3 races of monsters at his disposal. What are these races like, and how are they treated? For that, we'll take a trip back to Volo's Guide to Monsters. When Maglu beat the Goblinoid races in a subservience, he taught them all different things. He taught the goblins to fear his cruelty, turning them into petty bullies. The bugbears learned how useful indiscriminate brutality could be. The hobgoblins received a bit of a different lesson when they were conquered. During their subjugation, they learned discipline. Discipline made them the natural leaders among the Goblinoid races. So the TLDR version, they don't get treated particularly well. I hope you enjoyed this intro to the mini-series on Goblinoids, and I hope to see you next week where we'll do a deep dive on goblins, their lore, culture, and examples on how to introduce them into your campaign in a more interesting way. If you like this episode, make sure to like, rate, download, just do all the things. It helps the podcast more than you can imagine. Shoot me an email if you have any ideas for the next D&D creatures you'd like a deep dive on.